Welcome, everybody. Today we have the pleasure of having as our guest Dr. Ariel Levy. He's a neurologist and movement disorders specialist at Hôpital Maisonneuve-Rosemont, part of the Université de Montréal Health Network. He's also an assistant clinical professor in the Department of Neuroscience at Université de Montréal. He holds a bachelor's degree in anatomy and cell biology from McGill University and his medical degree from Université de Montréal. He completed his neurology residency at the CHUM, Centre Hospitalier de l'Université de Montréal, and a fellowship in Parkinson's disease and movement disorders at the University of Toronto. His professional interests are in Parkinson's disease, tremors, and other disorders of movement. He regularly teaches medical students and residents in both hospital and outpatient settings. Tonight, he's going to talk to us about how physical activity maintains neurological health, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and beyond. And without further ado, Dr. Ariel Levy.
So thank you very much for this invitation. I think it's a great opportunity to speak to familiar faces and voices, even though they are on a small screen in front of me. So, and thank you very much for the introduction, Grace. And I think, we're going to talk about physical activity and how it's important to keep our brains healthy, and what gives you some maybe practical tips on how to go about keeping your brain healthy. Part of what we're going to talk about today is maybe briefly outline what these neurological diseases are that are helped by physical activity, talk about what kind of research that's being done, and discuss how physical activity helps the nervous system in treating and preventing Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease, discuss what specific forms of physical activity are helpful. And then, a presentation in 2020 or 2021 is not complete without a discussion of COVID and what kind of role that plays in implementing those strategies to keep ourselves healthy. So, what is the nervous system? I mean, it's a basic question, but I think it's important to realize that the nervous system is basically everything from the brain to the nerve that touches the muscle in your arm. There are multiple levels, so from the brain, the spinal cord, the nerves, and all of these function together in some way, many ways, to produce higher order functions such as movement, language, laughter, coordination. Each level has different functions, and each part of the brain has different specifications. So, for example, the left brain for most contains the language portion, and the individual unit in the nervous system is a neuron. It's a cell that produces electrical impulses within a whole network. So these neurons are a little bit, in the brain, and then they're connecting to the spinal cord, and the spinal cord connects to the muscle, and that's how I can lift my hand and scratch my nose, and take off my glasses, or, say stupid things on Zoom. So that's what the nervous system does. Now, what is a neurodegenerative disease? Well, it's a class of neurological diseases that presents as an abnormal aging of the nervous system. It is, people say, oh, well, I'm clumsy, or I'm falling, and that's because I'm old. But sometimes that is really caused by a more insidious, slowly progressing disease that makes our brain age and become a little bit less capable of functioning with time. And so, depending on where these degenerations start in the nervous system, and on and depending on where in what level the the nervous system starts, the degeneration starts, that's where we get different manifestations. And unfortunately, by the time the symptoms are present by the time you develop symptoms of these neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, the process that started in the brain started well before the actual symptoms. So somewhere between 5 and 10 years before, and sometimes some authors say even longer. And so there are no predictive diagnostic tests that are available to hasten the diagnostic process. So it's really the tip of the iceberg. The symptoms are really the tip of the iceberg. Everything underneath, the fire has already started. The slow burning fire has already started. And we don't know how to detect that before the actual symptoms start. And when the symptoms are present, unfortunately, it's usually too late to stop the process, to stop the wildfire. So what causes these diseases? It's really not clear. There are hypotheses, and I think that's what's the prevalent hypothesis is this so-called protein accumulation hypothesis. So I have this diagram here where you see the brain, and this slow burning fire starts at this basal part of the brain and then just slowly moves up, and the proteins just spread all around the brain and then cause dysfunction in those electrical circuits involving the neurons. So these proteins become misfolded and accumulate and spread like a slow burning fire. Now, unfortunately, this is a hypothesis, so we're not clear that if just removing those proteins will actually stop the disease. And there have been studies where they've tried to remove those proteins one way or another, and unfortunately that does not slow down the disease. And that may be because we are catching it too late, and it may also be that the protein is just a byproduct of some other process that we haven't discovered yet. The other possibility is that there is genetics involved. So there are genetic forms of neurodegenerative diseases. They occur much earlier in life, somewhere between the 20s and 50s, and have a clear pattern of inheritability. Older onset neurodegenerative diseases do not have such a clear pattern of inheritability, and having one gene does not necessarily mean that you will get said disease. And they may just play a role in producing or showing up or manifesting the symptoms and the disease, but they may be just modulating the basic neurological function. So there may also be, so what also may play a role in neurodegenerative diseases are environmental triggers. So why does somebody have one gene and their twin doesn't necessarily develop a neurological disease or neurodegenerative disease? Maybe the environmental triggers. So it's unclear if there is a sole environmental cause to neurodegeneration. Probably not. But most likely what happens is that it triggers the process of that slow burning fire. It's the match that lights the fire. And the first symptoms in some neurodegenerative diseases are usually involve organs that are exposed to the environment. So for example, the gut. So constipation is one of the first symptoms of Parkinson's, and loss of smell is one of the first symptoms of Parkinson's or Parkinson-like conditions. And these diseases and these organs are actually quite intricately exposed to the environment. So you think the smell, well, we're smelling the environment. We're digesting whatever food we have. So it's gut and constipation. So those are possibly environmental. There may be environmental triggers that may cause, may start the neurodegenerative process. So what is Parkinson's disease? Well, Parkinson's disease, so this is the first description of Parkinsonian patients. This was 200 years ago. We just celebrated the 200th anniversary of James Parkinson's essay on the observation of this physician from his apartment of people walking down the street and looking like they had shaking and having difficulty walking. So Parkinson's disease is a neurodegenerative disease involving the involuntary motor system. So we have a voluntary motor system, again, raising my hand, scratching my, opening a jar. The involuntary motor system, which is mainly walking, fluidity of movements, and the dysfunction occur in the involuntary motor system. And usually the first symptoms are shaking, slowness, and stiffness, and it's associated with an early loss of smell, constipation, and acting one's frightening dreams in bed. So there are images and videos of patients being in their bed and acting out like they're being chased by an animal. And in their dream, if you question them once they wake up, they'll tell you, well, I was dreaming that I was being attacked, and they're actually acting it out in bed. And when we sleep and when we dream, we're usually physiologically paralyzed. And that paralysis is gone. And that's one of the first symptoms of Parkinson's, actually. And symptoms are mainly caused by a loss of a neurotransmitter called dopamine in the brain, and that dopamine is we give dopamine to improve the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And as time progresses with Parkinson's, one realizes that the gas, that dopamine that we give does not necessarily function continuously and homogeneously over time. And it basically functions like a roller coaster with periods of on and off. And medication effects are more unpredictable after 5 to 10 years of the disease. And there's no perfect medication, and there's no perfect medication that slows the disease. So with time, patients become fluctuating. And this is where physical activity plays a role, because they tend to be better when the medications work, and that's when you try to time the physical activity. Whereas when they're in their off periods, that may not be as beneficial. So what benefit does Parkinson's disease? So when I'm talking about these diseases, that's why I'm talking about neurological health, is because that's the model that we have. We have no clear evidence that physical activity prevents any of the disease. There is some ideas that it may do that, but it definitely improves the symptoms. So usually we divide the disease in 3 phases: diagnosis phase, medications, and then the late phase. And basically, early on, it's useful to prevent falls, educate the patient about disease, improve physical capacity, and store that physical capacity, improve endurance, improve flexibility, and improve strength. And in the mid phase, usually that's when you start falling, where you start having difficulty walking, and that's where certain types of physical activity like gait training, so training how to walk, relearning how to walk, because walking is an involuntary act that we do that can be problematic in Parkinson's. And I think that's where one can get the help. And finally, towards the later stage of the disease, it helps prevent the complications of being immobile in Parkinson's. So a couple of studies, very small studies, where about 128 patients did high intensity treadmill exercise. So basically they were very active. They saw about a 10% improvement in the symptoms after 6 months. And basically these patients had to do high cardiovascular exercise, about 80% of their maximum heart rate, 4 times a week. And the only problem with that was people just didn't do it. And that's why it didn't work. And it worked pretty well in the disease course. And basically what I took out of this study was that you do need to sweat for at least 4 days a week. And if you do that, you can actually help symptoms in neurodegenerative diseases, in particular Parkinson's. What about falls? Falls in Parkinson's, and this goes for any kind of other causes of falls, Fall prevention is important because one needs to realize that when one falls, unfortunately, the complications and the consequences of falls are quite high. If one fractures a hip or fractures a bone and has to be in the hospital, well, there are, being in a hospital setting is actually dangerous for an elderly person. And when one is in the hospital, one can get confused, infections, bedridden, and that starts the slow snowball down of loss of autonomy. So preventing those falls is an important and a very key intervention that can prevent, can help patients. So early in Parkinson's, for example, one can improve stability when walking, can be done with a self-program at home, and it is more beneficial in the long run. It's a long-term investment. Late in the disease course, it just maintains the achievements that you've had in the first phase. Try to increase the difficulty of the activity. It prevents falls about 20%. So it's 1 in 5 falls, which is quite significant. And it increases walking speed, which is very important because, as you know, if you're too slow in Montreal and you're walking and crossing a street, I don't think you're going to, the Montreal drivers will be very patient with you. Parkinson's is not just a motor condition. There are non-motor symptoms, so in particular, constipation. Physical activity helps constipation in general, but in Parkinson's in particular, it helps constipation in combination with food, fiber, tree, and probiotics. It's also helps with sleep and fatigue. So physical activity improves how you sleep. It improves total sleep time. It decreases the sleep latency, so the time before you fall asleep. And in combination with good sleep hygiene, physical activity is even more effective. And by sleep hygiene means not having the TV on when you are watching television, when you're heading to sleep, or having your phone, or reading a tablet, or having lots on your mind before going to sleep. And those are very important things. Physical activity helps mood, and so that's actually quite obvious with a lot of other conditions. So mood is improved during group physical therapy, because when you are in a social environment, you're able to do this physical activity with other people and exchange and have time with other people. Above all, it improves the outlook towards one's illness, one's self-esteem, and the perspective of social role. And it's in combination, if necessary, with medication. And there have been studies that in cardiovascular physical activity and dance therapy and music therapy that helps memory, but it's not very significant when you do objective testing, when we bring them into the clinic to actually do the cognitive tests. Now, what about slowing or preventing the disease from starting? Unfortunately, we're talking mostly about mice. So Parkinsonian mice are very far away from being Parkinsonian humans. So the evidence is less robust. There are some biochemical mechanisms on the animal models. So physical activity does increase this brain-derived nerve factor, which kind of increases the connections, the little connections that go to our different neurons and help that circuit function well. But this is really in Parkinsonian rats. So again, a far cry from a human being. It improves brain volume. So basically, physical activity keeps the brain larger. Now, a larger brain doesn't necessarily mean a better brain, but in general, when the brain is too small or too shriveled up, unfortunately, that is a sign of neurodegeneration. It may prevent the dementia and therefore decrease the risk of dementia in Parkinson's disease. Okay, so what forms of physical activity has been studied? So in particular, cardiovascular activity and endurance. So any kind of cardiovascular physical activity is important. So an increase in heart rate required for at least 1 hour, 3 to 4 times a week.
No.
Muscle tone activity, mainly for fall prevention, prevention and adaptation to overcome the freezing of walking, and activity to improve general mobility. And so there's a huge literature about dancing, Tai Chi, boxing, etc. And so this was summarized in a guidelines in Parkinson's disease, and basically saying that you must refer, or you should consider referring to physiotherapists that are capable of treating Parkinson's disease. So what about COVID-19? Well, unfortunately, COVID-19 just does poorly on all neurological diseases, because anytime somebody with a neurological or neurodegenerative disease is ill, they tend to get much worse. COVID-19 is no exception. Usually deteriorates anyone with a neurodegenerative disease. There are a bunch of mechanisms. They become delirious. So this transient confusion during any kind of infection. It's much worse with COVID-19. The COVID-19 can actually, or the virus can actually infect parts of the brain in very rare cases. And there are indirect effects also, because these patients are locked down and they actually just stay home and they're not able to walk around and do things, and they lose on the gains that they have from previous physical activity. They tend to require more medication, they're sicker, their pneumonias are worse. It's about a 6 to 20% mortality, depending on the other medical conditions. They're isolated, there are no group activities, and they fear going outside. And unfortunately, that's what we've seen in the literature with a large cohort of Italian patients in Italy early on in the pandemic last year. And that's what we saw with COVID-19. And what about the difficulties in doing physical activity with COVID-19? And unfortunately, that's true for any kind of physical activity. You're locked down, you're home, you're socially isolated, you have no more support groups. Any kind of home care that was done by the CLSC coming home to take care or give you some services, now they're transferred all to the CHLDs or hospital care. There are some solutions. So breaking the isolation with calls, video chats, telerehabilitations. There's a lot of telerehabilitation that's going on. That's usually through Zoom or Teams. And walks outside and inside. Having stationary bikes also can help. There's no risk of falling on a stationary bike. And those are tools, tips, and tricks that are available to have to break that the complications and the consequences of COVID-19 on being at home. Now, what about Alzheimer's disease? So Alzheimer's disease is another neurodegenerative disease, and it starts in the brain processing areas of the brain. So the cognitive memory. The classical symptoms include forgetfulness of recent events, progressing to a more generalized forgetfulness and even language loss. In the long term, can be associated with hallucinations and paranoid ideas. And unfortunately, the only treatments that we have are to stabilize symptoms, and they don't really have any medications that can slow the disease. And again, that's kind of the slow burning fire that starts parts of the brain and then just spreads around. So here it starts in this place called the hippocampus and just goes all the way around to the brain after about 10, 15 years. So what are the risk factors for Alzheimer's disease? So what's very clear is that having environmental risk factors such as smoking, diabetes, sleep apnea, concussions, and late life depression are all risk factors for developing Alzheimer's disease. Now, in my opinion, that's not what triggers Alzheimer's disease. It just adds confounding factors that age your brain much quicker. So smoking is definitely not good for the vessels of your heart, but it's also not good for the vessels of your brain. And it makes your age, it's adding insult to injury. Same thing for diabetes and sleep apnea, concussions. If you have multiple hits to your brain, well, that's not really going to be very good for anything. So education seems to protect against Alzheimer's disease. It's more that you start much higher and you end up having more coping mechanisms when you have the symptoms that start. And physical activity tends to protect against the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, and social engagement protects against the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. So in terms of genetics, it's very complicated. So there's somewhere between an 60 to an 80% inheritability of Parkinson's disease, of Alzheimer's disease. There's a gene called ApoE4 that confers about an extra risk. So about 17% of the population has this gene. And there are about 20 other genes that actually play some role in the development of Alzheimer's disease. And unfortunately, one of these genes does not necessarily have one role in causing Alzheimer's. This gene, unfortunately, does. So if you have it, if you have 2 copies of this gene, the risk of getting Alzheimer's disease is actually quite high. All right. So what about physical activity in Alzheimer's disease? So it's a complex question since cognitive impairment may coexist with, like I said, vascular risk factors. So diabetes, high blood pressure, sleep apnea, all these things play a role. These confounding factors, unfortunately hasten and accelerate the cognitive decline. Physical activity helps stabilize the consequences of those vascular risk factors. So if you do physical activity, you tend to have a better stability in these high blood pressure and diabetes and heart disease. So it's good for the heart, it's also good for the brain. Physical activity improves blood flow to the brain, so therefore preventing that quick deterioration or that slow deterioration of those electrical circuits between the neurons. And long-term physical activity increases hippocampal volume, whether that increases short-term memory, it leaves to be desired, but in general, that's where the short-term memory is housed in the hippocampus. So it's very difficult to study physical activity in Alzheimer's disease because there are different forms of physical activity. Early in disease early in the disease when you have symptoms does not necessarily mean early in the pathological process. So sometimes, and the outcomes vary in different studies. There are many confounding factors. So if the older you get, the more, health problems that you collect. And if you collect them all, well, you get disease. So unfortunately, trying to say that this physical activity helps this problem is not necessarily always present. So cardiovascular physical activity can improve cognitive reserve in people with Alzheimer's disease. Low intensity activities such as walking, cycling, and swimming are all helpful. High intensity activity such as resistance training can help, but difficult to apply in the community as a structured group. So what about physical activity? What in particular? Well, simple and objective measures. Find something that you like and do it. Walking about 1.4 kilometers a day, 1 hour of golf, tennis, all these things reduces the risk of cognitive decline by a factor of 2 compared to those who do not participate in physical activity. So yes, you may have Alzheimer's disease, but those symptoms are actually better and you are able to function better in your environment despite that disease that has already started. So doing at least 15 minutes of activity at a time, 3 times a week, and such as walking, hiking, biking, aerobics, swimming, water aerobics, all of that has been associated with a significant lower risk of dementia. It doesn't mean that the process hasn't started. It just means that you've coped better and your brain is coping better because of the physical activity. So is one better than another? There's no real difference. Like I said, pick something, enjoy it, and do it, and keep on doing it. It is how much energy that is expended that makes the difference. So if you are just doing a leisurely stroll, there is less efficient than doing a hardy game, a match of tennis. There are activities that are beneficial beyond the actual physical aspect, so social, interactive, cognitive challenges, psychological aspects. And these effects may have more beneficial aspect in women, more so than men. And it's unclear why, but it may be the role of estrogen, or that men are not part of these studies, or that men don't like to do the physical activity. So in terms of cognitive activity and Alzheimer's disease, so what I'm talking about cognitive activity means guided cognitive exercises. So not the physical activity, but now working your brain. So refers to this guided cognitive exercises designed to improve specific cognitive functions, as well as enhance performance in untrained cognitive tasks. So anecdotal evidence that this helps in healthy people, but a role in helping those with disease is not established. So it's unclear if you're preventing the disease with these tasks, or you're trying to slow the progression. And that's not clear. Usually these cognitive tasks are unstructured. They trigger strengthening of basic cognitive functions, so like recall and orientation, and it's usually standardized. There are online tools that have been tested, but not all user-friendly. So I'm talking about things that have been studied in papers that have been published, and unfortunately, not all of them are very user-friendly, and not all of them have been tested, and not all of them are free. So a good exercise can work on attention and memory. Those that have reported trials are not free, and apps on tablets and smartphones are variable in their efficiency or effect on improving memory, so your mileage may vary. And so this is just a sampler of the ones that I found in the study. So there's one called Brainer, there's one called Sociable, Captain's Log, and all of these basically I tried to find actually to use one, and you all have to pay. You have to pay for them, and they're all like behind a paywall. But basically, what they are is a variation, small variation of the cognitive tests that we do in clinic, and they just train you to be better at them, and that helps you in your day-to-day tasks. So there are many things that are reported on the App Store to tell you, oh yes, that works, but I don't trust what they tell me on a review. But some of these have been tried, and some of them do work. So in conclusion, neurodegenerative diseases progress over time. There are no medical treatments or interventions that slow the process down. Physical activity benefits in promoting brain health in both Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. Physical activity should be something you enjoy and are capable of doing regularly with enough intensity. And cognitive training can help maintain attention, language, and visual spatial skills in Alzheimer's disease. So that's it for my presentation. And if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Dr. Ariel Levy. If you want, you can either write your questions in the chat, raise your hand, and one of us will unmute you, or click on the reaction button at the bottom right and raise your hand that way. So let's see. Ariel, are you going to
I don't see the chat, so let me just hold on here.
you're going to close the
Yeah, I'm going to just close the PowerPoint 1 second. So stop here. Okay.
well, so
All
far
right.
the
Oh, yeah.
chat has a compliment.
Oh, okay. Very informative presentation. Thank you. Okay, nice. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's see. Do we have any hands? Okay, Ruth Nabby, please unmute yourself.
Oh, thanks. That's a very comprehensive overview. And I'm just wondering, from what you say, can we assume, and I know it's not true, but one would think one could assume, that the highly educated, well exercised during all one's life, cognitively very active, socially active, could one assume that there's a guarantee that you will not have Alzheimer's or any type of dementia? Because people that I know in that who have practiced that form of living have succumbed to dementia.
So there are no guarantees in medicine.
No.
So unfortunately, it is a sum of multiple small things. So if you are ApoE epsilon 4 positive, despite all the education that you have and all the education and physical activity you do, the longer you live, the more chance you have of getting Parkinson's. And if you live minimally to the age of 40 or 50, if you have those genes, the likelihood that you develop Parkinson's are quite, Alzheimer's, I was talking about Alzheimer's, is quite high. So unfortunately, there is no guarantee. What physical activity and education do is allow you to have coping mechanisms and strategies and strengthen your neurons to be able to maintain attention, problem solve, or do anything to problem solve and function despite having mild memory problems. And so you can stay at this mild memory impairment for many, many years, and then eventually, and much later, develop Alzheimer's disease. That much later might be at 101, or might be never because you succumb to another illness. The longer you live, the more likely that you will develop a neurodegenerative disease. And that's unfortunately the biggest risk factor. 50 years ago, we died of cancer and heart disease. We barely had the time to get to Alzheimer's disease. And all these descriptions in the 1800s and Parkinson's and Alzheimer's were probably younger variants, people that had genetic predispositions. And it was quite rare because, well, you died of a car accident, you died of cancer, you died of heart disease, you died of a massive stroke. So, yeah. So no guarantees. I do see a few questions about the Alzheimer's gene. Canadian recommendations and guidelines recommend not to test spontaneously for the ApoE epsilon 4 genotype unless you have a family member that had Alzheimer's disease at a relatively young age. Relatively young meaning between probably 50 or 60. And you can get tested, but what are you going to do about it? So the question is, if I have nothing to offer you to prevent the disease, what are you going to do with the information? Is it peace of mind? If you have peace of mind, that's fine. Or you're going to have Damocles' sword above your head saying, TikTok, when am I going to get Alzheimer's? And what do I do with my life? So there are ethical questions about actually doing this test when you don't have a treatment to prevent or slow down the disease. And once we do have treatments for that, then it becomes much more important. So most trials in Alzheimer's disease are recruiting people that are ApoE positive because they are targeting their therapy to people with a common gene. And so you can find out by asking a neurologist to do the test, but they'll give you the same answer that I just gave you, which is what are you going to do with the information? Also, in theory, it used to be that life insurance companies could ask about your past medical history and your genetic tests, and basically refuse you insurance if you were at risk of getting these diseases. I do believe the federal government passed a law barring insurance companies asking you if you had genetic tests.
Thank you, Dr. Levy. We have a question from Dorothy Lackstone. What is the link between leaky gut and Alzheimer's disease? I've read about this. Is this true?
So I don't know for Alzheimer's disease, but for Parkinson's, there is a whole hypothesis about the gut-brain axis, meaning something in the gut triggers the neurodegeneration, those abnormal proteins clumping together in different parts of the brain. And unfortunately, that's where, so there are multiple hypotheses for Parkinson's, not necessarily for Alzheimer's. So for Parkinson's disease, unfortunately, so we find the abnormal proteins in the neurons, because we all have neurons in the gut, in our salivary glands. And so one of the studies that has been done is to do these biopsies of different places. So they do a colonoscopy and take a piece of your colon and find out if this protein is accumulated in the colon. And they find that absolutely these proteins, these abnormal proteins, are found in the neurons in the gut. And so there is a growing evidence that the not necessarily only the gut, but the environmentally exposed portions of our body. So salivary glands, olfactory system, smell, digestive tract. Those are the places where the neurodegenerative process triggers. I don't think it's only this. I think there needs to be some sort of genetic predisposition, but it's not just that. Yeah.
The next question is from Rachel Gabai. Does a vitamin regimen help at all?
Lots of studies, very unsatisfactory, so minimally helpful. Unless you are vitamin deficient. So if you are vitamin B12 deficient, you should probably be supplemented for vitamin B12, but otherwise, there hasn't been clear evidence that vitamin supplementation improves anything in terms of any kind of neurodegenerative.
Another question, when did Michael J. Fox get Parkinson's?
Very good question. He probably had it for about 20 years now. He's undergone multiple surgeries for Parkinson's. I think it was probably in the early 2000s, but don't quote me on that. I'm not quite sure.
Okay, there was a few questions about the gene E4, but you may have answered that question already.
Yeah, so I did answer that. How to get it tested? It's done by a genetic test. It's a blood test that's sent out to the States, depending on where it's done. The question is, what are you going to do with that information? And is it really will it change anything that you do in your day-to-day functions? It's more of a philosophical question than a medical one.
When Michael J. Fox got Parkinson's, it was mentioned that it came from a virus at his work. Others got it too. Is that possible?
It's possible. It was a trigger, but it's not there's not clear evidence for that. And as far as I know, I don't know.
Okay. Any other questions from the floor? Any hands? Yes, Evelyn Shaheen, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself. No, you have to unmute yourself. It didn't work.
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
When you were talking about the physical activities, you mentioned the word resistance.
Yeah.
Is it? It's one of the exercise. What is the mental?
So resistance training is really doing weights, doing carrying things so that your muscles are strengthened. So that's what resistance training is.
But mental, example for mental resistance.
Oh, so there are interesting apps and programs that help that. What usually is good is trying to find a game where you needed to keep your attention in the game, and you are doing it with other people. So you know, I can give strategy games where you need to concentrate and be able to say, oh, okay, well, this is how I'm going to get to this point. So that's what cognitive resistance. There's not one specific thing that's helpful, but it's examples. People do Sudoku, people do crosswords. These are all things that keep your brain active and not very passive at doing something.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We have a question from the chat. Apart from exercise and brain exercise, what is best to reduce risk of faulty, leaky gut, please?
Unknown. Unknown because we don't know where the problem lies and how it does lie. What are the environmental triggers? So it's not very clear how to prevent this leaky gut in the gut-brain axis. Unfortunately, we don't have that answer.
Do you happen to know what percentage of the population gets Alzheimer's?
So I saw that question, and I'm looking back in my notes. So it's about 30% in patients 85 years or older. So it's quite common. The older you get, the more likely it is. So the older you live, the more at risk your brain stops working. And that's unfortunately the biggest risk factor for any kind of neurodegenerative.
Thank you. Any other questions? No, I think we're set. Thank you so much, Dr. Ariel Levy from our beautiful Iraqi community and of Montreal for a beautiful lecture. We learned so much. I learned so much. I will not get tested. And we're going to invite everyone to unmute yourselves. Let's see. Ask all to unmute. You can applaud and you can say whatever you want to say. Before we end, I want to thank, of course, the office staff, Françoise, Viola, and Linda.
Viola.
And go ahead, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Grace.
What? Excellent presentation.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you.
That again and again.
That's good.
Yeah. It's good. He's 50, huh?
You look extremely young, like a student. Just a beard. Yeah, extremely young you look. A beard and forget it.
I have a question. What happened to President Reagan?
Oh, he had Alzheimer's.
I know,
disease.
but I mean, was it over many years or just like that or what?
So it developed shortly after he left office, about a year or two after he left office. And that was probably in the mid 90s. And then it evolved until his death.
Okay, it's late. You got it late.
Thank you.
Okay.
As you all know, we have a Super Tuesday.
Thank you very much, Grace.
Thank you.
Next week we have Katan, who's going to talk dentistry, how to keep your pearly whites smiling. And the week after, we have a Purim event.
Gracie, it's recorded, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, sorry, it was Ellie's birthday.
Oh, happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Oh, thank you. Ellie, come. They're wishing you a happy birthday.
Good
So,
sign that you remembered.
here is the birthday boy.
Who's birthday?
I'm still kicking. I'm still here and kicking.
And you remember.
Remember. Because
That's the one. Yeah, I know. That's
yeah,
I
the
got it.
lecture about. Yes,
Yeah.
we remember.
The
That's
last
true.
few words were very scary. What he was talking about.
But we'll listen to the recording. I know but thank you. It's a very good idea. Every Tuesday we have something.
So as you know, we welcome all donations. Everybody is welcome to call the Spanish and Portuguese or go on the special link that we email everyone. All funds, all donations go into the general fund of the Spanish and Portuguese. You can make a donation in honor of Dr. Ariel Levy. And we thank you again, Dr. Levy, for an amazing evening.
Synagogue, it's another one.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. It was a pleasure joining you guys this evening, and I wish you all the best and keep healthy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, we're off.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care. Thanks.
Thank you.